Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Allison Bainbridge, and I am delighted to introduce this evening's discussion about a gem of a book. After you listen to our two authors, you will want to run out and buy several copies of this book. And I'm saying several because you will want to share it with friends, but you also want to hold on to one yourself. The Metropolitan Museum of Art of New York City, colloquial known as the Met, is the largest art museum in the US. Its permanent collection contains over 2 million works. Divided among 17 curatorial departments, it's over 150 years old and has been featured in children's literatures, movies like Harry Met Sally, and welcomes millions of visitors per year. Yet, until Christine Coulson's book, Metropolitan Stories, the public knew little about what went on behind the walls. Another world exists. The hallways and offices, conservation studios, storerooms, and cafeteria that are home to the museum's devoted and peculiar staff of 2,200 people, along with a few ghosts. The book unfolds in a series of amusing and poignant vignettes in which we discover larger than life characters, the downside of survival, and the powerful voices of the art itself. The result is a novel bursting with magic, humor, and energetic detail, but also a beautiful book about introspection and an ode to lives lived for art, ultimately building a powerful collage of human experience and the world of the imagination. The Wall Street Journal calls Metropolitan Stories a love letter to the monumental institution. Metropolitan Stories reads like a work by John Cleaver. Coulson captured the spirit of the place and brought it magically to life. And I have to say, I'm so excited because I am going on my first trip in a year and a half to New York to visit my daughters next week. And on the schedule is a trip, and it's a trip to the Met, and I'm going to be using the book because there's a Metropolitan Stories tour I can do. So I'm so excited. Christine can talk about that later. Christine Coulson began her career at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1991 as a summer intern in the European Paintings Department. She returned in 1994, and over the next 25 years, rose through the ranks of the museum, working in the development office, the director's office, and the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts. In 2019, she left the Met to write full-time. You can find more at her website, www.christinecoulson.com. We are also extremely fortunate to have novelist and freelance journalist Dune Arbus with us today to discuss Christine's book with her. In her reportage work, she frequently wrestles with the hidden codes in a subject's spoken language, its hesitations and reversals, allowing what the speaker seeks to obscure to become the revelation. Two of her 6 nonfiction books, co-authored with longtime collaborator Richard Avedon, integrate her text and his photographs to craft a collision of words and images into single labyrinthine narratives. In the fall of 2020, she made her debut as a novelist with The Caretaker, published by New Directions. The fact that she has been responsible for the care and dissemination of her mother's photographic work for the past 50 years could suggest that a book entitled The Caretaker might relate to the author's personal experience. But the protagonist of this novel is the most singular man, and his story is his own. You can find more about her book at www.thecaretakerbook.com. Please sit back and enjoy this wonderful discussion on art and writing. Dune?
Hi. So I want to start with the whole question of fiction and reality and the tension between them. It seems like frequently novelists get asked, where does this come from in your real life? Which always struck me as kind of strange because as a reader, when I read a novel, to me, it's a closed world. It never occurs to me that it has anything to do with anything outside itself, except if I'm pointed at that. So you kind of have walked the tightrope here. You've got a real place where everything happens, and which most people know or have some idea, accurate or not, about. And the kind of sort of real people that become fictional characters, not to mention the rest of it, which we'll talk about later. but I wonder how you feel about that balancing act, and and whether you ever have a sense of betraying one or the other, the fiction or the reality.
Hmm. I think that, yes, I'm writing about a very public place that people have their own experience with. So they have their own memory of it, their own affection for it, their own um, illusions about it. I mean, what I loved about being on tour for this book before the pandemic, I traveled to 14 different cities, and I met these people who adore the Met, and hold it up as this kind of beacon of beauty and aspiration. And a lot of them had never been there. But they feel so connected to it. So I feel like there's a lot to wrestle with in that. Um, but I also felt like no one was talking about the museum in the way that I feel about it. And so what
Mm.
I could do in writing this book is show people what I see. And I think there's the rub, is that people, people go to the museum once in a while, and some people once in a lifetime. And I got to live there, and that's different. And just like living in your own home, there's a familiarity there. There's a knowledge of objects and their position and their resonance and how they operate within your space and with you. I took that on with those objects in those galleries, and when you get that opportunity, there's an intimacy that develops, and a lot of the museuminess of that place breaks down. And so I think that what I wanted to show people is a side of the museum that they don't know is even there. And maybe a way of looking at those objects that they don't realize they could experience themselves. You know, chapter 2 of this book is written from the point of view of an 18th century chair in the Reitzman galleries. It's just sitting there in this period room. So, and in my view, that chair has a lot to say, and that chair has its own memory, and that, chair has its own voice. And so, I think that's where, somebody else walks in that room and they have an experience with a different object. It speaks to them in a different way. And I like that openness, that this is about my Met and my memories of that place, but it's also about the magic I feel in there. And that took time to develop. And so I felt like I could write that story.
What do you mean it took time to develop? Are you talking about your relationship to the place, or are you
I
talking
think
about
people go to the
having?
museum and they're intimidated, they're kind of overwhelmed, and they think everybody else knows what they're doing except for them.
Yeah,
They think they're supposed to know a lot of art history that they don't know, and so they go to the label to kind of mine what they're supposed to, why they're supposed to like this. And I think when you get rid of all that, um, and knowing that it's there for you is wonderful. I have profound respect for that scholarship, but I think there's something more important in just responding to a work of art in a more pure way. And I think it's very hard for people to do when they just go there and visit.
you used this terrific phrase in something when you were talking about your experience there, I guess, which was being able to relax around the objects. And I think that's, certainly very key about being in a museum, being around things, but also about sort of life in general. I mean, there's a certain degree of where you have to take it for granted, and then you are sort of free to really know it.
Well,
I,
and isn't that what imagination is about? Like, you can't
yeah.
be
Mm,
really stressed and be really imaginative at the same time. You
yeah.
have to you have to sort of allow that to happen, and there's a certain openness that comes with relaxation. And so I think your imagination can't really take flight until you're in that state of mind. And the museum doesn't really make you feel that way.
No,
But
in
maybe
fact,
they still could.
its obligation to inform is a little bit in conflict with that. Like you
Yeah.
said, people
Yeah,
have to
and you
go.
and it is, it's extraordinary and it's magnificent and it should be overwhelming. You don't want it to feel like the street outside. You should walk in
Right.
there. It should feel like a temple. It should feel overwhelming. So all those things are good. Um, but I think if you can't let go of them, if you can't shed some of that when you're in the galleries and you're having that much more intense experience with a work of art, then you're missing something. And so
Yeah.
one of the things that I wanted to do is sort of show people how you could think about those works of art, and the long road they took to wind up in the museum.
Yeah.
And we forget that sometimes. The museum kind of sterilizes that quite a bit. We put them in this pristine environment with beautiful lighting. And, like that chair, one of the things I think is very tragic about that chair is that it will never be sat in again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this thing was designed to do only one thing. And so it was made in the 18th century and it still has its original upholstery, which is why I really love it, because I feel like there's still 18th century dust in that chair. It still has that original stuff from the 18th century. And so I feel like you can pull that thread a little longer and feel that passage of time with something like that. But that chair will never be sat in again, because it's reached this sort of ultimate retirement home.
Yeah. Right.
And, now it'll be cared for in the most beautiful way. But we've killed it a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I just, sometimes I think it's worth tuning out of the museum and what they have told you to do, and maybe look at things from a different point of view.
Do you want to read a little bit the voice of the chair?
We should do that. Okay. So I imagine this chair really wanting to be sat in. And so I talk about one moment in its museum life. One time at the Met, a small boy, not more than 3 years old, wandered past the barriers in the Reitzman galleries and headed straight for me. Almost 225 years had passed, but he reminded me so much of those toddlers back in Parma. Come on, little guy, I thought from behind the gallery ropes. You can make it. The boy's plump hands extended forward, propelled by his thick, tumbling waddle, his shoes clomping on the gallery floor. I felt like I was hanging from a cliff, waiting for him to grip my arm and save me. Then a breeze of moist heat floated past as his mother grabbed him at the very last second, just before he reached me. That was 1978. I still dream about it. I imagine the boy climbing up onto my seat, his pleasant folds and warm springy pudge nestled between my arms, a small puddle of drool soaking into my velvet, the life of it racing through to my frame.
So when did let me call it for want of a better word, surreal like this, the chair speaks, and many other things in the book, when did that emerge? Was that always the way you felt about objects in the place, or did you have to write it before you knew you felt that way?
You know, I I think I had to write it. I think I had to. I did. Um, the only time I can remember thinking consciously about a moment, and I write it, it is a chapter in the book. There was a horrible moment in the museum in 2011 when an early Renaissance marble statue of Adam fell on a Sunday night. No one was around, and this statue fell from its pedestal and was crushed, and
Had enough.
in thousands of pieces. And I remember that Monday morning, it was like a death in the museum. I mean, there's nothing worse that can happen than the destruction of a work of art in a museum. And so it was like a crime scene, they gridded the floor and they were taking all those little pieces of stone and dust and putting them into these little Ziploc bags. And I remember thinking at that moment, I wonder what the statue felt like in the air. Not when it hit the ground, but just that moment of release, that little whee, this thing that was never supposed to move, suddenly like getting a shot at it. And I remember very consciously thinking about that and thinking it was probably very inappropriate at the moment, but it was. And then, years and years later, and Adam gets rebuilt and kind of there's a resurrection of Adam, and he has his own gallery now. He's like a little rock star. So it's a very happy story. But when I sat down to write, I wanted to write one of the first things I wrote in this book were the paragraphs describing the feeling in the air from the statue's perspective. And I think that was just something I had to get out. The Met gave me a sabbatical in 2017 to write this book. And, I had been writing for the Met, but always in other people's voices. I was kind of a ghostwriter and a speechwriter. And so for me to finally be able to write in my own voice was incredibly liberating. And then I think all this stuff bubbled up to the surface because it was like time to get that baby out. And so I don't think I ever consciously thought about those things, but obviously I spent 23 years thinking about all of this. And isn't that the way writing works? I never took notes. I never kept a journal. The things I write about are the things that kind of return to me. And I actually think that's a really important part of the process. Like when I write about a work of art, I never look at it. I never look at images of it. I want to write from memory because I think the things I remember are the things that are most important to me in the painting or in the object itself. And so it's interesting then after it's written to go reconcile that with the actual work of art and see, how the proportions of my own imagination connect with the reality of the thing.
Do you find things that were in your mind that aren't there in the reality?
What I always get wrong is the scale. Things that I think are monumental are like a foot high, and things that I think are giant are tiny. So I think I always get that wrong. And I think maybe in my head, it's like proportional to the importance to me, or I feel like they're monumental, or I feel they have such significance or something, but I always got the scale wrong. But
what you said about Adam in the air, and that was the first thing you wrote. Did you feel at the point that you wrote it that you had the key to the whole book, or was it just
well, no, I don't think so. I think that in the end, I'm not sure how I arrived at this, but I did wind up writing about kind of two collections, the art, which I give human characteristics to, and the staff, who I also wanted to write about, and not necessarily, there is a chapter devoted to the curators, but I also wanted to write about all the people who are very much unsung, but equally as devoted. So I write about the guys who change the light bulbs and, electricians and plumbers. And I wanted to write about them as like a collection as well, as kind of their works of art in their own way, in their own eccentricity. And the connective tissue of that place is everyone's sort of shared devotion to the sort of larger endeavor of the museum. And I think people don't think of it that way. I think people don't think of, the way that the Met is this town in this building. I mean, we outsource nothing. Because we have it all inside. And so those 2,200 people which includes 900 guards, they're all part of what you experience when you go into those galleries. And so I wanted to write about sort of those two pillars, and how there is this dependency upon them. I think I write right at the beginning of the opening sentence is that, we think we're saving and protecting the art, but it's actually the art that's saving and protecting us. And I think that's why people stay for so long, because we don't really know how to leave that place and what we get from those things.
But, and also because you, they, whoever we're talking about, feel needed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, but also I think there's something that experience in the galleries that I described, that intimacy grows into something more like dependency
Uh-huh.
over
Uh-huh.
time. And so
Huh.
I wanted to capture that magic. I wanted to sort of show people that. And so I went into this without a concept of the structure or the format of the book, but more a very clear intention of what I
Mhm.
wanted to write about. And I knew I wanted to write it from different points of view. So the book
Yeah.
is structured as 16 vignettes from 16 different points of view. And so I knew I wanted to do that. But then how that strung itself into a novel was where it got complicated.
Can you talk about that? I mean, can you talk about why it is absolutely a novel and not a bunch of short stories in which certain characters recur? Um, the sort
It's
of
a,
sense of
yeah,
inevitability of the progress of it.
it's a novel in the most fundamental way because you have to read the chapters in order. I think by definition, a book of short stories is something you can dip into
Hmm.
story number 11 without reading the previous 10. You can't do that here. You have to read them in order. And I feel like there's more than just repeating characters. I mean, you are aggregating knowledge as you read,
Yeah.
but that knowledge is preparing you for kind of a growing strangeness. So that, I wrote the end of the book, and I don't want to give it away, but I wrote the end of the book quite early. And so I was very much writing to that ending for a long time to get the reader ready for what was going to happen. And make them feel like what was going to happen made complete sense. And so
Mm.
that's very hard to do if you're going to do something extreme. Well, then you have to get the reader comfortable enough. And I think that's where, your first question about what's real and what's true, I feel very strongly as a writer that all those authentic details about the geography of the museum, the physicality of the place, but also the language we
Yeah.
use and the details of how the museum functions and the weird departments and the weird players, all that, those little strands of truth are actually creating the infrastructure to allow you to take those leaps of the imagination, because it all can't be crazy. Like, it all can't just be like anything can happen at any time. You've got to have some rules. You have to have some constraints to what that magic is going to be, when that sort of more surrealist stuff is going to happen. Well, there needs to be some rules around that. And so I found that structure and those constraints really helpful to, that only I understand them,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I think it makes the reader feel comfortable,
Right.
and stay with you. So when the chair's talking, they're game. And so,
And that's
you
very early in the book.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I wanted to give a hint. It's only 3 pages long when that first story about the chair. I wanted to let people know quite early that that's possible.
Hmm. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
they were going to be, the book opens describing who the staff is and who we are, and it kind of puts that stake in the ground. But I immediately wanted to shift gears to say, like, and the art has something to say too. And in doing that, I think it kind of set up the cast list
Mm. Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
gave people a sense of the players. And that structure, I worked forever on I used to have this piece of foam core that I would fold up, and it had sticky notes on it with each chapter and what you learned in each chapter and who was in each chapter and how it worked. And I would sit on the bus from the library and play with these sticky notes and try and come up with that architecture to make it all work, and see where the holes are and what people needed to know. So I was retroactively going back to stories to give some details that would help them later. Breadcrumbs, it's a classic thing.
Yeah. But in stories that you'd already written, or did you write a whole chapter because there seemed like a hole?
No, I never wrote a whole chapter because it seemed like a whole, but certainly had to go back, and I would understand that if I wanted a certain chapter to be someplace, I had to lay the groundwork more solidly earlier on.
Uh-huh.
So that was important, particularly because I think the rhythm of the book is very important. I like the idea. I always, as a reader, I love a short chapter. I love a
Yeah.
long chapter and then like a 2-pager. So that the rhythm of how the vignettes would work, and the way that the voice would change,
Yeah.
that you'd get something very lyrical, but then you'd get something very rhythmic, because it's a different point of view, and so you had to shift gears a bit so people felt that. So it was a delight to write from all those different perspectives, but you had to make sure the reader felt like something had changed so that they were
So,
with you.
how much are you thinking about the reader when you're writing, or do you feel like you have other responsibilities?
I feel like the reader showed up with the editor
Uh-huh.
because I had readers along the way, who were reading as I was writing chapters, and they helped with this a bit. But I felt like when the editor came in, that's when, like, I felt primarily what she was doing was clarity.
Huh.
We
Can
need
you talk
clarity on
about
that.
any specific example of some?
Like, we would sometimes, it was a matter of location. I would write some long passage, and then she would say, "Are we still in the basement?" And I'd say, "Yeah." She's like, "We need to know that again. You have to remind us of that, because because it was, I'm so familiar with the museum and the place and think it's crystal clear, but
Mm.
it's 4 blocks long and 2 blocks deep, and so keeping track of all that and navigating a character through that when you're not familiar with it, I would have to have more landmarks, more grounding in that. So if I had a consistent flaw, it would be assuming a knowledge of the Met that nobody else has.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And
You
so
you said something about this book allowed you to write in your own voice, and a lot of that is clear. But do you think of this as your own voice, even with the shifts of point of view and everything? Not that it does seem like a single voice, but
yeah,
does it really feel like
I
yours?
think certainly the people who know me, like, I showed up in this one. I think the humor is
Mhm.
definitely
Yeah,
my voice.
yeah.
And probably some of the opinions, people know, it's fine.
Shush.
Uh, um, but yeah, I think that there was some of it that even people who wouldn't know my writing, because the whole point of being a speechwriter is that you write in somebody else's voice well enough that it sounds like them. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the secret sauce. And so, but when people read it, they feel like I showed up, and so
Uh-huh.
I do think it's there. I do
Yeah.
think Um, there's a there's something also about that rhythm and some of the I love a one-word sentence.
Mhm.
Um, uh,
Mm.
and I love a certain. I learned from also the editing. Apparently, I love the word tender.
Oh dear.
My two most frequently used words in this book. We went through it, and they kept circling it, and I thought it was amusing because it completely sums up the Met. The two most frequently used words were tender and swagger, which is it. I
Oh
mean,
yeah, right. That's a building.
massive ego at the soft side, and that's the museum.
Sometimes it's been my experience that you happen on a simile or an adjective or a phrase that kind of hijacks the sentence
Mm.
and says no, it means this, and you have to like free yourself from the tyranny of that phrase that came to you, so obviously it meant something. Anyway, this is a long way around.
Especially if it's a good one.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's the point. Can you think of anything like that that you had to either like?
Okay, well, I'm gonna catch you in your own question now,
Oh dear.
because I'm gonna read you to you where you do that to us.
You mean it's too good and I
Yeah,
won't let
this is
go?
so good. This is like one of the best descriptions I've ever read about people um, looking at art.
Hmm.
Once inside, he hangs back, watching over his little group like a conscientious parent presiding over an infant's wobbly first steps, as individuals gradually detach themselves from the group and tentatively embark on independent explorations. He makes a study of their rapt or baffled faces, their apathetic frowns, whisperings, the self protective folding of the arms across the chest, the pensive attitude of fingers poised against the cheek, their sophisticated squinting, the eyeglasses repositioned or removed for better viewing, the frustrated attempts to read the labels, the efforts to get closer, the efforts to remain aloof and keeps one's distance. That's from Dune's book. And it is such a good description of all the weird ways that people try and look at art and do this and they do this and they squint at the label, and that inventory of gesture
Hmm.
is just brilliantly rendered. And it's such, I've never read anyone like kind of categorize that very predictable pattern.
It's so great to hear it in your voice. Didn't sound like me, it sounded like your voice. There you go again.
So I can imagine you as a writer, though, I can imagine your phrases catch you more than mine catch me.
Mm-hmm. You mean you're freer, or
Well,
they
your writing takes on a fluidity that really it just goes and goes and goes and goes. And as a reader, you're just swept away by it. It's gorgeous. My writing doesn't do that. I think my writing has more it's more staccato. It's more
Mm,
I don't know. So I
the
think you
one word
probably held
sentence.
up by your own talent more than I do.
Yeah. Oh well, we all have to bear crosses. um, what did I want? Oh, I wanted to ask you about ventriloquism, about being a speechwriter,
Mm.
and were there a lot of a number of different people you had to write for, and you had to like, were you trying to mimic the verbal tics you'd heard, or tell me about it?
Yeah, I mean, I mainly wrote for one person. I mainly wrote for the director of the museum. Um, I wrote other things for other people, but a ghost writers never write and tell. But definitely, and you get that from speech writing is a lot about the the conversation you have before you write the speech, and all those verbal things come out, phrases come out, stuff like that, and it's your job to give it shape, which makes a book like this, when it's time to write dialogue, it's very easy, because I was using people as sort of the kernels of these characters, and then I have to leave that behind and develop the character into something real. Because of that, I kind of had a voice in my head for some of them. Particularly, it's not going to be a surprise to anyone to hear that the director in this book, so this book takes place in the first 10 years of my time at the Met. So it's the 90s. It's a completely analog world. There is no email. And, I'm young and wide-eyed, and there are all these larger than life characters running the museum, including the great director of the Met, who was our leader for 31 years, who this book is dedicated to, Philippe de Montebello. And so there has to be a director in my book, because the director is someone that everyone on the staff is always aware of and always attentive to, and no one more so than Philippe. And so I had to write about him, and there was no way to decouple the presence of that man in my early life, and with all of his grandeur. He's a very, very grand Frenchman, and he is incredibly intimidating and knows it. But he was also a magnificent leader and did wonderful things at that museum. So you wound up working twice as hard to meet the standard that he had set for the museum. I mean, it was an amazing way of leading. But at the same time, I wanted to write a character that was interesting. And I certainly, as the story unfolds about him, I did not have access to the kind of information that I write about in this book about his inner thoughts and feelings. But that voice is very strong. And so that was very easy to write how he would speak, and, loves to throw in a bit of Latin, loves to kind of, there was just a way that he kind of used language quite sparingly in a way, but at the same time, sort of floridly. And it was a magnificent combination. And I write that story begins with a real bit of truth, which was back in those days when I was delivering important memos to people in the museum. I delivered a memo to Philippe de Montebello in 1996. It was a briefing memo about a meeting he was going to have with Karl Lagerfeld. And the memo said, "Mr. Lagerfeld will bring his muse. The muse will not speak. Do not address the muse." And I think that was another moment where I deliver this memo, and in my head, I'm thinking, well, what if Philippe brought his own muse to the meeting and there was like a muse showdown? Because we have plenty to choose from. And it's not till, it's 21 years later after that I sit down to write this book, and I write a story about the director of the Met shopping for a muse from all of his collections. And so that's a perfect example of kind of truth in sort of documentation, truth of voice, and then complete imagination taking over the rest.
Yes.
So all the objects I talk about are works of art in the collection. So all of that is informing it, but
yes, I love the leaners.
the muses are often leaning.
Yeah.
So yes, yeah. So I think that, I think even the writing process was like, you never start writing a speech from the beginning and write it all the way through to the end. You tend to kind of, where you want to go, and you sort of start from the middle, and then you write out, and you kind of find an introduction, and then you have to loop back because you have to repeat yourself all the time. So I think this book is like a really long speech.
Would you, I mean, I think of these as parentheses, the chapter called We and the chapter object lesson.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if you'd like to read them one on top of the other, or you want
I
to
could do
breathe
that.
first?
I could do that.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
I'll
I
read
think they're
part of
great together.
I'll read part of each one.
Ex-
So we is the first chapter in the book, and it is about who we are as the staff. We are generations of golden children, thousands of staff members raised by the Metropolitan Museum, put in its ward and shaped and stretched until our eyes can spot beauty like we're catching a ball, quick and needy, clutching it to our chest so it is ours, all ours. Our knees buckle as we learn every one of the museum's tangled paths, every gallery, every limestone hall, every catwalk and shortcut, every stairway up and down and across and over, until our muscles, tutored and trained, always bend us in the right direction. They are the objects, the art, the very stuff of the place, the thing the public comes to see and longs for us to sing about loudly and clearly and with every breath until the visitors are too tired, too inspired to see another bronze, another altarpiece, another sword or portrait or vase. After buying a bag of proof in the shop, a sack that says the museum has been done with Van Gogh napkins to prove it, the visitors leave. We and the objects stay. We have our evenings to cling together and our mornings to reunite. We connect like neighbors across a fence, one side always knowing more. We like to think it's us, but it's them. Our hungry scholarship scratches for what they've already lived. Those objects were there, saw the whole thing, right in front of them. Watched the tomb door close, pinching the sunlight until it narrowed to one last blinding stripe, then thump, gone. Okay, so that's from them. I mean, that's from us. And the much later in the book is a chapter called Object Lesson, and it's from their point of view. Survival is a funny business too, a losing game, literally. They love us and we lose them all. The ones who made us, the ones who gave us, the ones who sat down and played with us, the ones who held us or just laid eyes on us, the ones who bought, traded, and sold us, cleaned us, redeemed us, brought back the sheen on us, loved us, learned everything there is to know about us. Imagine how many reflections that ancient mirror has seen. Now imagine every one of them dead, gone. But we live on. We are the proof, sticky but silent, hanging on that wall, standing on that pedestal, the proof that anyone was ever there at all.
Well, that's pretty gorgeous too, you know.
Well, I think it's like that's the in between all the humor and the farce of life in a museum, and there's plenty of
Yeah.
that because that's the nature of any collective endeavor with eccentric people, is that bigger thing, that echo. And so even where I put those two statements of who we are and who they are and those points of view, I had to be careful of that. Because you're not necessarily ready to think about objects in that way right off the bat.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, so it's almost at the end that
Yeah,
they get
it's
to
the
have their,
penultimate chapter.
yeah,
It's just
yeah.
before we're going to go off the rails. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the physical book, the cover, the choice of the cover image, the font, the paper, because you know it's part of the meaning of the book is that it is
Yeah.
an object.
I love you for that, Dune. Yeah, and it is the objectness of the book was really important to me.
Mm.
And the I remember when I was signing my contract, and there were all these clauses about with my publisher about, royalties and foreign rights and whatever. And I said, I don't really care about that. And the lawyer who was working with me said, well, what do you care about? And I said, the font. I really care about the font and the paper, and I want a deckled edge. And he was so happy. Finally, something you care about. And so, because I wanted it to feel like the Met, I wanted thick paper. I wanted the font of this book is the font that we used in the 90s. It's Sabon, which is, that was like the standard font of Metropolitan Museum catalogs in that time. So I went and looked that up and found that. And I think all of that matters in a way when you're reading it, to have a book that has the feel of an object.
Yeah.
And then the cover, I was very lucky. I was able to choose the designer for my cover. And I chose him because I liked the other covers that he had done. I'd never met him. And we just sent him the manuscript, and I had lots of ideas about what it should be. And in fact, he took it and read it and came back with the cover. And on the first shot, I just said, that's it. I could have never come up with that. I never thought of it. And he just nailed it. And I felt like he really understood the book. And I think I was ready for a fight, and didn't have to have one. So I felt good, that someone with his artistic sensibilities understood the book so well. I was kind of proud that he was able to craft that. I mean, it's mainly his talent coming to bear, but I loved that he read the book and that's what he created.
Yeah.
That was really satisfying. And so in the whole crazy process of publishing it, I think I got very lucky in finding him.
Yeah, well, luck is often what you make, your wisdom.
We'll see.
Yeah.
And I was glad they kept it for the paperback.
Yeah.
So it was, and at the Met, there was a sense of, they always really trusted me. They never asked about the manuscript. They never asked to read it. They gave me that year to write it, and I never showed it to them until it was done. And so I think part of me also, because it's such a familial relationship that I have with that place. And I was representing, so much family lore in this book. I always knew I wanted to write a chapter about the staff cafeteria.
Yeah.
This place within this, monument to beauty is the most horrific and ugly cafeteria. I mean, it puts, a hospital to shame. It makes the school cafeteria look incredibly glamorous. It's this terrible, dumpy place. And it's the one place where we all come together. And we sit around and we tell the same stories every single day. And those are the stories that often informed these chapters and the threads of the novel. And so there was something about making a beautiful book that contained our fairy tales and being able to bring that to everyone that I think was subconsciously affecting things too, because I was sort of, I was the one who was writing it down. And keeping these stories somehow documented, even though they're completely apocryphal and wildly inaccurate.
Yeah, well, that's the way with a lot of good stories.
Right. Exactly. But I think those then became, the kernels for stories. The story about the guards was a story I had heard. And if I'm going to read one more thing, the story of the guards was a story that I had heard over and over and over again. And I never knew who the two guards were. But then and I never knew if it was even true, but then about 10 years ago, a curator slipped me this memo that I'm going to read. The Metropolitan Museum of Art Interdepartmental Memorandum. To Richard M. Trackner, Senior Vice President, Operations, from Philip Peterson Little, Chairman, Department of Musical Instruments, April 27th, 1994. While preparing for our benefit concert last evening, members of my department encountered a naked couple engaged in the pursuit of carnal knowledge in a closet of the Uris conference room. Of course, we musicians are used to such indiscretion and indeed applaud this display of youthful enthusiasm. But if this usage is to be encouraged, the closet door should be equipped with an inside lock to prevent interlopers from being nonplussed, and staff users should be asked to check the day sheet first for possible schedule conflicts. I mean, that memo, I mean, first of all, it does so much work for me as a writer because it completely sets the stage for what the Met was like in the 90s. It was a deeply formal place. You would never write someone's name without having their full name and their title. And the way in which that is written and the way that it's really talking not so much about the fact that two people were found having sex in a closet. That's really not the issue. The issue is that they didn't consult the day sheet first before they decided which closet to use. And I love that because that is the museum. That whole that language, that way in which it sort of is always problem solving, and that to me was a great place to start. And then I get to write those characters because I don't know who they are. So who is going to get themselves into that situation? And then in the end, that's not even the story of that story. That's just, the beginning of that character, Henry Radish's, journey in that particular moment in the museum. So, to be able to pull from those things, and almost for that to have, sort of proof of something that we all have loved to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, there are other memos in the book too, which have exactly that tone. I mean, so whether the real thing is imitating your memos.
Well, and I was trained to write that way. So if you, I wrote a lot of memos in my day. And so it's this very specific language. And like any place, we had our own way of speaking. And, and each of those 17 curatorial departments, each has their own way of expressing themselves, and they each had their own personality. And so that was sort of overridden by an institutional voice, and all of that. It's like being fluent in a foreign language. In my heyday, I could pump out those memos left and right with that very specific pattern. Yeah.
Is there any sort of wistfulness about not being there in that capacity?
I think there's wistfulness about, growing up. What's wonderful about writing about a time period like this, it was a time when I really knew nothing and was so
hard to get back to that, isn't it?
So ambitious. And the museum has a way of kind of consuming you. And we used to joke that we were sort of plucked from the playground because they could spot us and pull us in. And then that was it. It was your intellectual life, your professional life, your social life. It's the closest thing I have to religion. And it's all in that building. And so I would be there, 12 hours a day, and it was everything. And so, but this particular time, that time under Philippe, that time when I was arrived at the museum and revisiting all these characters and ideas and writing from that point of view was lovely. I mean, and it is, there is a nostalgia. You don't recognize the heyday when you're in it. And there was something very special about that time. And so I think it's less nostalgia for being at the museum every day. I'm at the museum all the time. And so I haven't left that behind. It is very much like home. I can go there anytime. I still have all my access and I'm happy to be there.
Yeah.
But I've kind of gotten rid of the, the politics and the
Mm,
day pressures of it. Um, so I've just, it's nostalgic for youth and um, the beauty of being naive.
yeah.
The beauty of not knowing is kind of a wonderful place to be.
Yeah. Well, we can all go backwards.
Definitely. But there was real discovery in that. There was real glamour in that, and that was also this is a very New York book, so it's the time before celebrity. It's the time when social life in New York was very important.
Mm.
And those social figures who were involved in the museum, people like Mrs. Reitzman, they ruled the world then. And so, it's kind of fascinating to think of that time and the magnitude of those people versus now, where it's a very different kind of um, celebrity and importance is put.
Do you think you found your way there, by happenstance, or
No,
because there was always something in you that?
I mean, I grew up going to the Met. And so, but I think the turning point for me was um, I was a summer intern at the museum in 1991
Hmm.
in European paintings. And I think the moment I went through one of those doors in the galleries, and people who read this book will now start to notice those doors. They're kind of painted the same color as the wall, but you go through these doors and you enter this whole other world. And that very lush and glamorous and colorful gallery world is replaced by this black and white world where these hallways exist to kind of transport people and art and all kinds of things behind the scenes. And I think the moment I crossed that threshold, I thought, oh, this is it. Like,
Mm.
I found my people. I need
Mm.
to be here. I need to be here all the time. And that was really important. That was immediate. And I think that that was so different than just, I knew the museum well, I knew the collection well, but this was something else.
Yeah.
And so I knew that's where I wanted to be. And so it was just a matter of getting myself somehow
Oh
back there,
yeah. Well,
there. Yeah.
I know you've got the stuff
That,
to get
I mean, it
yourself
was
there.
really important to me. But when I started there, I was, an assistant to the assistant to the assistant to the assistant.
Mm.
You know,
Mm.
I
Yeah.
sat on a stool and shared my desk with two other people, and it was great. I mean, it was
There's something so uh, gripping about the sense of this world within the rest of the world that's, that almost has no sense of what's outside of it.
right.
Um,
Yeah, and
and
it
has its
doesn't.
own, as you say, language and
Yeah,
rules. And yeah,
and
it's
there's
really,
only a couple of times in the book where people from the outside come in. Um, one being the photographer who winds up coming in the into the paintings conservation studio, and another one being the Melvin, the guy who lost his job and winds up in there. And it's so jarring to have these kind of interlopers pushing
mm,
into our sacred spaces. And we almost don't know what to do with them. We're such a, it's amazing that the public shows up every day and essentially we ignore them.
yeah. Yeah.
Like the fact that it's completely, the whole endeavor is for them.
Mhm.
But somehow um, it didn't matter. It was a kingdom within a kingdom in a way. And we liked it like that.
Yeah.
Well, we need to, on that note, on that lovely note, we need to say goodbye and thank you both so much for this lovely conversation. And as I said, I can't wait to go visit myself and take the tour based on the book. And at the beginning, I mentioned you'll want to buy several copies. You may want to buy 5 copies. Perfect Mother's Day gift, by the way. And it's kind of like intellectual escapism, you know, as you were saying, it doesn't really take into consideration the outside world. It's its own world. So you can go into your own little world here while you read it. And we have copies, plenty of copies here at the bookstore. You can call us and have it sent to you. You can come in. We're open 10 to 5 every day. You can also order it online at bookpassage.com. We want to thank both of you so much.
One thing I want to just mention, because I think readers will enjoy this, on my website, which I think is in the chat, ChristineCoulson.com. Every work of art mentioned in the book is on my website in a kind of scroll. So it's a nice companion for readers, so you don't have to Google works of art that I mentioned. You can just follow, it's all divided up by chapters. So it makes for a nice visual treat while you're reading.
Great companion, yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
thank you so much. And thank you to all our supporters and viewers. We appreciate you. We appreciate your continued support of the bookstore and authors and readers. And everybody stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So long.
Bye-bye.